In the spring of 1943, the Luftwaffe fighter squadrons stationed across occupied Europe carried a reputation that bordered on mythological. These were not ordinary pilots. They were aces, men whose names appeared in newspapers and propaganda films, whose kill counts stretched into triple digits, whose tactical brilliance had shattered air forces across Poland, France, and the Soviet Union. Major Günter Rahl had over 200 confirmed victories. Lieutenant Walter Krupinski flew with such precision that ground crews called him the artist. Captain Johannes Steinhoff led formations that moved like choreographed dance, exploiting every weakness in enemy tactics. These men flew aircraft that represented the peak of German engineering. The Messerschmitt Bf 109 and Focke-Wulf FW 190, machines that could outclimb, outturn, and outgun most Allied fighters. Their confidence was not arrogance, but calculation. They had seen Polish biplanes fall like leaves. They had scattered French squadrons across burning fields. On the Eastern Front, they had achieved kill ratios that defied belief. Sometimes 10 or 20 Soviet aircraft destroyed for every German loss. The Luftwaffe fighter arm considered itself invincible, not through propaganda, but through documented results. When intelligence reports in early 1942 indicated that American heavy bombers would soon begin operations over Europe, the reaction among German pilots ranged from curiosity to dismissal. Americans were untested. Their pilots had no combat experience. Their tactics were theoretical, learned from manuals rather than forged in battle. The assessment was clinical and seemed reasonable. This would be another air force to break, another addition to the Luftwaffe's growing legend. Yet within 2 years, this elite force would be shattered. Not by superior American fighters, not by better trained pilots, not by revolutionary technology. The Luftwaffe would be crushed by something they never saw coming. Something so mundane and unglamorous that even after the war, many German veterans struggled to accept it as the weapon that defeated them. The first American heavy bomber missions over occupied Europe began in August 1942, launching from bases hastily constructed across the English countryside. The 8th Air Force arrived with Boeing B-17 flying fortresses and consolidated B-24 Liberators, massive 4-engine bombers designed to strike deep into enemy territory in broad daylight. German fighter pilots watched these early raids with professional interest. The formations were loose, the defensive fire uncoordinated, the American crews clearly inexperienced. On mission after mission, Luftwaffe squadrons tore through the bomber streams, exploiting gaps, isolating stragglers, racking up kills. In October 1943, a single raid on Schweinfurt cost the Americans 60 bombers destroyed, and over 600 men killed, missing, or captured. The Luftwaffe had seen these numbers before. They indicated an enemy on the verge of collapse. Intelligence assessments confirmed what combat suggested. American pilots were young, some barely 20 years old, with training measured in months rather than years. Many had never fired their guns in combat before their first mission. They flew in tight formations that limited maneuverability, following doctrine that prioritized mutual defense over aggressive tactics. German pilots, with years of experience and hundreds of kills, faced opponents who often died on their first or second sortie. The aircraft themselves seemed to confirm American inferiority. The B-17 and B-24 were large, slow, vulnerable targets. Early escort fighters like the P-38 Lightning and P-47 Thunderbolt had limited range and seemed outmatched by German defenders. When the Americans introduced the P-51 Mustang in late 1943, it represented a significant improvement. But even then, Luftwaffe aces maintained confidence. Individual aircraft quality mattered less than pilot skill, and in pilot skill, Germany held an overwhelming advantage. What the Germans did not understand, what their intelligence assessments and combat reports failed to capture, was that they were not fighting an air force in the traditional sense. They were fighting a system, and that system operated according to principles the Luftwaffe had never encountered. Behind the drama of aerial combat, away from the spotlights and propaganda cameras, American air bases in England operated with a precision that bordered on obsession. The activity that defined these bases was not heroic or glamorous. It was methodical, repetitive, and bureaucratic to a degree that seemed almost absurd. Every aircraft had a maintenance log, a thick binder that traveled with the plane from its factory delivery to its eventual retirement or destruction. Each flight, each maintenance action, each part replacement was documented in triplicate using carbon paper. Mechanics filled out forms before and after every mission, recording oil pressure, engine temperature, hydraulic fluid levels, tire pressure, ammunition counts, and dozens of other data points. These forms were filed, reviewed, and analyzed by logistics officers who tracked patterns across entire squadrons. The maintenance-to-aircrew ratio at American bases exceeded 3-to-1. For every pilot and gunner flying combat missions, 3 ground personnel supported them. Mechanics worked in shifts around the clock, following standardized procedures that specified exactly how every task should be completed. Oil changes occurred at precise engine-hour intervals, not when a mechanic judged it necessary. Parts were replaced according to schedules calculated by engineers in the United States, not based on individual assessment of wear. Spare parts inventory was managed with the same obsessive detail. Warehouses at each base maintained stocks calculated by formula, with reorder points triggered automatically when supplies dropped below specified levels. Supply officers tracked consumption rates and predicted future needs using statistical methods. The entire system was designed so that no single person's judgment or expertise was essential. Anyone trained in the procedures could perform any task, and the results would be consistent. This approach was not traditional military thinking. It came from American industrial culture, from the assembly lines of Ford and the quality control methods of manufacturing. The military had adapted civilian efficiency techniques to aerial warfare, creating a system where individual brilliance mattered far less than collective reliability. To German observers, when they eventually captured documents describing these procedures, it seemed like madness. The paperwork alone appeared to consume more time than the maintenance itself. The rigid adherence to schedules seemed to ignore the reality that every aircraft was different, every situation unique. Experienced mechanics knew their aircraft by sound and feel. They could diagnose problems that no checklist could predict. The American system appeared to distrust expertise, to replace judgment with rote procedure. But the American system had one overwhelming advantage. It worked, and it worked at a scale the Luftwaffe could not match. Luftwaffe maintenance culture had evolved from different roots. German mechanics were craftsmen, trained through apprenticeship systems that dated back centuries. They learned their trade from masters who had learned from their masters, accumulating knowledge through experience and intuition. A skilled mechanic could hear an engine running rough and know immediately which cylinder was misfiring, which valve needed adjustment, which bearing was beginning to fail. This expertise was real and valuable. German mechanics could coax performance from damaged aircraft that should have been grounded. They could repair systems with improvised parts when supply chains failed. They could maintain aircraft under conditions that would have paralyzed a more rigid system. In the early war years, when the Luftwaffe operated from established bases with adequate supplies, this approach worked brilliantly. Aircraft were often assigned to specific pilots, especially aces whose personal aircraft carried kill markings and custom paint schemes. Mechanics took pride in maintaining these machines, ensuring they performed at their absolute peak. The relationship between pilot and ground crew was personal, built on mutual respect and shared mission. This created motivation and dedication that no bureaucratic system could match. But the system had vulnerabilities that only became apparent under sustained pressure. Documentation was minimal and inconsistent. If a mechanic discovered a recurring problem, that knowledge stayed with him, unless he personally shared it. If he was killed, wounded, or transferred, his expertise vanished. There was no systematic way to identify patterns across multiple aircraft or squadrons. Each base, each unit, operated with slightly different procedures based on local leadership and available expertise. Part supply depended on a logistics system that grew increasingly strained as the war expanded. When a specific part was unavailable, mechanics improvised, cannibalizing damaged aircraft or fabricating replacements in base workshops. This worked in individual cases but created maintenance nightmares as aircraft accumulated non-standard components. No two planes were exactly alike after months of improvised repairs. Most critically, the system assumed that expertise and judgment would always be available. It worked beautifully when experienced mechanics had time to properly maintain a manageable number of aircraft. But it could not scale. As losses mounted and the demand for sorties increased, as experienced personnel became scarce and replacement mechanics arrived with minimal training, the individual expertise that held the system together began to fracture. The Luftwaffe was discovering a truth that American industry had learned decades earlier. Systems based on individual excellence are inherently limited. They cannot expand beyond the supply of excellent individuals. They cannot maintain consistency across multiple locations. And when those excellent individuals are exhausted, killed, or overwhelmed, the entire system collapses. By the summer of 1943, Luftwaffe intelligence analysts began noticing anomalies in the data. American bomber formations were growing larger, not smaller. Sortie rates were increasing despite steady losses. Aircraft that should have been destroyed or damaged beyond repair appeared in subsequent raids. The Americans seemed to have an inexhaustible supply of planes and crews. German pilots reported the same pattern from the cockpit. Shoot down 10 bombers on Monday, 20 more appear on Thursday. Damage 50 on a mission, they come back repaired within days. The mathematics made no sense. American production capacity was known to be large, but these numbers suggested something beyond mere production. They suggested a system that could absorb damage and continue operating without pause. The reality was visible in the maintenance logs that American crews meticulously filled out after every mission. An aircraft returned with battle damage. Within hours, a damage assessment team inspected it, photographed it, and filled out forms detailing every hole, every damaged component, every system requiring attention. These forms went to a maintenance control officer who scheduled repairs and ordered parts. The parts arrived from supply depots that had anticipated the need based on historical data. Mechanics worked in shifts following detailed repair procedures. Within 2 or 3 days, the aircraft was test-flown and returned to service. This was not heroic. It was not clever improvisation by brilliant mechanics. It was a system operating according to design, processing damaged aircraft through a standardized workflow that required no individual genius. The mechanics were competent, but not exceptional. The procedures were detailed but not complex. The entire operation ran like a factory, which was precisely the point. German bases could achieve similar results with exceptional effort. A dedicated crew working around the clock could return a damaged aircraft to service quickly. But this required pushing men to exhaustion, pulling resources from other aircraft, and relying on the judgment of experienced mechanics who were increasingly scarce. The Americans achieved the same results routinely, with scheduled shifts and predictable workloads, day after day, week after week. Without let-up, the sortie rates told the story in numbers that could not be disputed. In early 1943, the 8th Air Force launched perhaps 200 sorties per week. By the end of 1943, this had increased to over 1,000. By mid-1944, weekly sortie rates exceeded 3,000. The Luftwaffe, by contrast, struggled to maintain the sortie rates it had achieved in 1940. Operational readiness, the percentage of aircraft available for combat, declined steadily from over 80% to below 50%. For Luftwaffe commanders, the situation was maddening. They had the pilots, they had the aircraft, they had the tactical skill. What they lacked was the unglamorous capability to keep planes flying day after day without pause. The boring work of maintenance logistics, the endless forms and checklists, the obsessive tracking of engine hours and part lifetimes. This was determining the outcome of the air war more decisively than dogfighting prowess ever. Could the psychological impact on German fighter pilots intensified throughout 1944. They were not being outfought in the traditional sense. In individual engagements, experienced Luftwaffe pilots still held advantages. But the nature of the air war had changed from a contest of skill to a war of attrition, and attrition favored the side that could sustain presence. Pilots who had flown 2 or 3 missions per week in 1940 now flew 2 or 3 per day when aircraft were available. The Americans came morning and afternoon, striking different targets, forcing constant scrambles. Luftwaffe squadrons would intercept one raid, land, refuel, and immediately scramble to meet another. The physical and mental exhaustion accumulated relentlessly. The mathematics of replacement became brutally clear. A German ace with 100 kills faced constant streams of American pilots on their first or second mission. He could shoot down 5 of them, and 5 more would appear the next day. The Americans seemed to have infinite replacements, while Luftwaffe losses, though numerically smaller, struck against a far more limited pool. Every experienced pilot lost was irreplaceable. The Americans replaced losses faster than the Luftwaffe could inflict them. Worse, the Americans were learning. Those inexperienced pilots who survived their first missions absorbed lessons quickly. Tactics improved. Formation discipline tightened. Escort fighters extended their range and increased their numbers. By late 1944, American fighter groups actively hunted German aircraft. no longer content to simply protect bombers. The predator-prey relationship was reversing. The strain showed in ways that statistics could not capture. Veteran pilots developed thousand-yard stares, speaking little between missions, smoking cigarettes with trembling hands. Younger pilots arrived full of enthusiasm from training schools and died within days, sometimes on their first sortie. Unit cohesion, so carefully maintained in earlier years, deteriorated as losses forced constant reshuffling of personnel. Morale collapsed not from defeatism, but from exhaustion and the growing recognition that individual skill no longer mattered. An ace could be the best pilot in the world, but if his aircraft was grounded for lack of parts, he contributed nothing. German pilots watched inferior opponents flying inferior aircraft achieve air superiority through sheer persistence. The humiliation was compounded by the knowledge that they were not being beaten by better warriors, but by a better system. Ground crews shared the demoralization. Mechanics worked 16-hour shifts, cannibalizing 3 damaged aircraft to create one flyable machine, knowing that tomorrow would bring the same desperate struggle. The pride in craftsmanship that had once defined their work gave way to exhaustion and improvisation. Every patched-together aircraft was a temporary solution to an unsustainable problem. The grind broke men more effectively than combat ever could. Casualties from stress-related illness increased. Accidents due to fatigue multiplied. Pilots and mechanics were worn down, not by superior opponents, but by the relentless, unchanging pressure of an enemy that simply never stopped coming. Major Günther Rall sat in the dispersal hut at his base in Germany on a March afternoon in 1944, staring at a maintenance report that made no sense. His personal aircraft, a Bf-109 that had carried him through dozens of missions, was grounded. Not from combat damage, not from mechanical failure. It was grounded because it had reached its engine hour limit, and the replacement engine had not arrived. This was the third time in 2 weeks his aircraft had been unavailable for reasons unrelated to actual malfunction. The frustration was maddening. The engine ran perfectly. The aircraft flew without problems. But regulations required replacement at specific intervals, and the parts were not available. Meanwhile, American bombers droned overhead, while one of Germany's highest-scoring aces sat idle. Rall had over 200 confirmed kills. He could visualize combat situations in 3 dimensions, predicting enemy movements seconds before they occurred. He could place bullets with precision that other pilots envied. His situational awareness allowed him to track multiple aircraft simultaneously, engaging threats in order of priority, breaking off before entering vulnerable positions. None of this expertise mattered when his aircraft sat in a hangar, waiting for parts that might arrive tomorrow, next week, or never. The contrast with the Americans was inescapable. Rall had watched from the ground as formations of B-17s passed overhead, some trailing smoke, some with visible damage, all maintaining formation. He knew from intelligence reports that many of those damaged aircraft would be flying again within days. Not because American mechanics were more skilled than German mechanics, but because the American system did not depend on skill. It depended on procedures, parts availability, and logistical planning that assumed damage was routine and planned accordingly. This was the invisible weapon. Not better pilots, not superior aircraft, but the boring, unglamorous work of supply clerks and logistics officers who ensured that parts arrived before they were needed, that maintenance schedules were met, that aircraft availability remained high, regardless of combat losses. The Americans had created a system where excellence was not required because the system itself was excellent. Rahl thought about the mechanics at American bases who filled out forms in triplicate, who tracked every maintenance action in logbooks, who followed checklists even for routine tasks. It seemed inefficient, bureaucratic, wasteful of time and paper. Yet those mechanics could maintain sortie rates that the Luftwaffe could no longer match. The boring efficiency defeated the brilliant improvisation. Later that afternoon, a replacement engine finally arrived. Mechanics installed it overnight, and by morning the aircraft was ready. Rahl flew 3 missions that day, shooting down 2 American fighters and damaging a bomber. His skill remained intact. But as he landed after the 3rd sortie, exhausted and low on ammunition, he watched another formation of American bombers cross the sky toward their targets. Tomorrow they would return, and the day after, and the day after that. His personal victories, impressive as they were, meant nothing against an opponent that measured success not in individual brilliance, but in sustained operational tempo. The ace had confronted the system, and the system was winning. By the summer of 1944, Luftwaffe operational readiness had fallen below 40%. Less than half of available aircraft could fly on any given day. The reasons were multiple and interconnected. Parts shortages had become chronic as Allied bombing disrupted German industry and rail networks. Fuel allocations decreased as refineries were destroyed and oil supplies from Romania were cut. Maintenance personnel were diverted to other duties as Germany mobilized for ground defense. The entire support structure that kept aircraft operational was disintegrating. The Americans, by contrast, maintained operational readiness rates above 80%. Their system, designed to function even when individual components failed, proved resilient under pressure. When one supply depot was threatened, production was shifted to others. When transportation routes were disrupted, alternatives were implemented. The redundancy and standardization that seemed wasteful in peacetime provided overwhelming advantage in war. German commanders recognized the problem but could not solve it. They issued orders demanding better maintenance, faster repairs, more efficient use of resources. These orders changed nothing because they addressed symptoms rather than causes. The fundamental issue was not effort or dedication, but system design. The Luftwaffe maintenance system had been built around expertise and improvisation, and both were now exhausted. Aircraft sat grounded not because they were severely damaged, but because minor repairs could not be completed. A hydraulic line needed replacement, but the specific part was unavailable. An engine showed oil pressure irregularities that required investigation, but no mechanic had time for thorough diagnostics. Landing gear required adjustment, but the base lacked proper tools. Each problem was individually minor, but collectively they devastated readiness rates. The Americans faced similar issues, but processed them differently. A hydraulic line failure triggered an automatic parts request and a standardized repair procedure that any trained mechanic could follow. Engine irregularities were diagnosed using checklists and known solutions. Landing gear adjustments followed documented specifications. The system absorbed routine problems without degradation because it was designed assuming problems would occur. Luftwaffe pilots watched their operational strength dissolve. Squadrons that once fielded 30 aircraft struggled to put 10 in the air. Missions were scrubbed not from casualties, but from inability to generate sorties. The Americans continued their relentless campaign, flying thousands of sorties weekly, while the Luftwaffe managed only hundreds. Air superiority, once taken for granted, slipped away. The collapse was not dramatic. There was no single catastrophic defeat, no day when the Luftwaffe ceased to exist. Instead, it was a slow suffocation. Operational capability declining steadily until organized resistance became impossible. By the final months of the war, Luftwaffe fighters rarely appeared in significant numbers. Not because pilots refused to fight or aircraft had been destroyed, but because the system that kept them flying had broken beyond repair. In the decades after the war, historians interviewed surviving Luftwaffe pilots and mechanics, seeking to understand how Germany's air force had been defeated. The answers, when they came, were often reluctant and tinged with bitterness. These were men who had taken pride in their skill, who had achieved individual excellence, who had fought with courage and dedication. Admitting that none of it had mattered was psychologically difficult. Günter Rall, who survived the war with 275 confirmed victories, spoke candidly in later years. "The Americans did not beat us in the air," he said. "They beat us on the ground. They beat us with their logistics, their maintenance systems, their ability to keep aircraft flying day after day. We had better pilots, better tactics, often better aircraft. But we could not maintain the operational tempo they sustained." Walter Krupinski, another high-scoring ace, made similar observations. Individual skill meant nothing when your aircraft was grounded for parts. You could be the best pilot in the world, but if you could not fly, you could not fight. The Americans understood that wars are won by presence, not by excellence. They were present every day, in overwhelming numbers, and we could not match that. Mechanics who had worked on Luftwaffe aircraft described the frustration of watching superior machines sit idle while inferior American aircraft filled the sky. German aircraft were often better engineered, more carefully built, designed by talented engineers. But they were built in smaller numbers, with less redundancy, with longer production times. When they required parts, those parts might not exist. The Americans built adequate aircraft in massive quantities with standardized parts that could be replaced quickly. Some German veterans remained defensive, insisting that given equal resources, German pilots would have prevailed. This was probably true, but also irrelevant. Wars are not fought with equal resources. They are fought with the resources each side can generate and sustain. The American system generated sustainable operational capability. The German system did not. The most striking admission came from officers who had commanded fighter wings. They described reading intelligence reports about American air base operations, about the maintenance procedures and logistics systems, and initially dismissing them as propaganda exaggerations. No military could actually waste time on that much paperwork. No system could actually be that bureaucratic and still function efficiently. Then they watched American sortie rates climb month after month and realized the reports were accurate. The boring bureaucracy worked precisely because it was boring and bureaucratic. This recognition was humbling in ways that combat defeat was not. Losing to a better fighter pilot allowed you to respect your opponent's skill. Losing to a better logistics system offered no such consolation. There was no glory in being defeated by supply clerks and maintenance schedules. The mythology of aerial combat, the romance of the ace, the drama of dogfights above the clouds, all of it had been made irrelevant by men filling out forms in triplicate. The story of how America defeated the Luftwaffe contains a truth that extends far beyond World War II aerial combat. It reveals something fundamental about how complex endeavors succeed or fail, about what actually matters when systems compete against systems. Excellence in dramatic, visible tasks cannot compensate for failure in mundane, invisible tasks. The Luftwaffe had excellence in piloting, in tactics, in aircraft design. These things mattered, but they did not matter as much as the unglamorous work of maintenance tracking, parts, inventory management, and procedural standardization. The spectacular is seductive, but wars are won in the boring details. Systems that depend on individual excellence cannot scale beyond the supply of excellent individuals. The Luftwaffe maintenance system worked brilliantly when staffed by experienced craftsmen working under manageable conditions. It collapsed when those conditions changed. The American system worked adequately, regardless of individual expertise, because it was designed not to require exceptional people. This made it resilient where the German system was brittle. Sustainability defeats intensity. German pilots could achieve higher performance in shorter bursts, but the Americans could sustain moderate performance indefinitely. In a war of attrition, the side that can maintain presence over time prevails over the side that achieves brilliance occasionally. The grinding, relentless tempo mattered more than peak capabilities. Modern militaries absorbed these lessons thoroughly. Every advanced military now operates with the kind of logistics and maintenance systems that seemed excessive to German observers in 1943. Operational readiness rates are tracked obsessively. Maintenance procedures are standardized and documented. Parts supply chains are designed with redundancy. The recognition that these boring administrative functions determine success in combat has become fundamental doctrine. But the lesson extends beyond military operations. Organizations of all kinds face the choice between systems based on individual excellence and systems based on sustainable processes. The former appeals to our admiration for talent and skill. The latter seems bureaucratic and soul-crushing. Yet in competitions between the two approaches, the sustainable process usually prevails. The mechanics who filled out maintenance logs in triplicate, the supply officers who tracked parts inventory with obsessive detail, the logistics planners who designed redundant transportation networks. These were the people who defeated the Luftwaffe. They never flew in combat. Their names appeared in no newspapers. No monuments honor their contribution. But they won the air war over Europe as decisively as any fighter pilot. The hidden order was never truly hidden. It was always visible in the maintenance logs, the supply requisitions, the standardized procedures that governed American airbase operations. What was hidden was its importance. Both sides underestimated how much these mundane systems would matter. The Germans learned too late that wars are won not by the best warriors, but by the best systems for sustaining warriors in the field. This remains true today. In business, in technology, in any field where sustained performance matters, the boring infrastructure defeats the brilliant individual. The unglamorous work of creating reliable systems, documenting processes, maintaining standards, this is what separates organizations that endure from those that burn brightly and fade. The lesson of the Luftwaffe's defeat is not that excellence does not matter. It is that excellence without sustainable systems cannot prevail against sustainable systems with adequate capabilities. The air war over Europe was decided not in dramatic dogfights but in maintenance hangars where mechanics followed checklists. The victors were not the pilots who got the glory, but the supply clerks who ensured parts arrived on time. The weapon that crushed Hitler's elite air force was not advanced technology or superior training. It was the hidden order of standardized procedures, maintained logs, and bureaucratic discipline that seemed wasteful to those who did not understand its power.